I woke up early this morning to the view of the pre-dawn sun catching the snow-capped peaks of the noble Olympic mountain range. It was across the water of the canal, and there were seagulls whirling and screeching above the boats that were moored out there. And this was all framed, it's almost like a picture frame of all these beautiful green hills and forest that were surrounding the entire scene. And I thought, what a beautiful environment. What a beautiful environment for a conference, and what a beautiful environment for man. And I thought, how fortunate that I'm here to see this. For only my seeing it gives this morning its beauty, and only my hearing it gives this morning its song. And then, drawn back to the reason for my presence here, I was deeply disturbed. I knew that this was not the view of those who called themselves environmentalists. They viewed my presence here as an intrusion, not as giving meaning to nature, but as spoiling its purity. That, indeed, was the message reiterated again and again during Earth Day. And I wondered, where did they ever get such a perverse view? You have to go back in time a little bit. At the time of the first Earth Day in 1970, some young people, intimidated by the pace and complexity of modern life, were looking either to rebel or to retreat, to tear down the system, or to withdraw to nature for a Colorado Rocky Mountain high. Children of Rousseau, they preached the inherent goodness of untouched nature and undisciplined emotion, the corrupting influence of reason, culture, and civilization. They preached economic egalitarianism and small-scale participatory democracy, the mystical infallibility of the collective will, and sacrifice of the individual to the group. And they were united in their hatred of a common enemy, modern American capitalistic society. Now, this was a very small minority of those folks, actually, the people who lived at that time. Most of their much more moderate contemporaries have grown up now to become our architects, accountants, and automobile dealers. Sure, they and everyone wants clean air, land, and water. But few want the demise of Western civilization and culture. Concerned with their individual values, well-being, and happiness, at root, most people's outlook is what might be loosely called humanistic, in favor of human values. But a small cadre, the Rousseauian residue of the Woodstock generation, never outgrew their fundamental cultural alienation and hostility. They never developed the slightest interest in humanistic values. For 20 years, they've been seething at the fringes of society, and now, like scavengers scenting a wounded animal, they're closing in on a vulnerable culture. This small group sets the moral premises of today's environmentalist movement, which is populated by many thousands of benevolent, unsuspecting people who still think environmentalism only means clear and clean air, land, and water. The cadre, however, knows otherwise. What do I mean by the cadre? This cadre is loosely divided into two competing but often overlapping camps: the deep ecologists and the greens. Now, let me define who I'm talking about. The first camp consists of the apolitical heirs to the countercultural movement, tending toward mysticism and nihilism, and sometimes paying explicit homage to the anti-technology Luddite movement of the Industrial Revolution. They see the environmental crusade not as a means of reforming society, but as a means of escaping or even obliterating it. These contemporary pagans and modern druids march under the banner of green lifestyles and deep ecology. Many of them are misfits, quite frankly, attracted to the bizarre and mystical as a means of escapism. Ms. Magazine, in one of its final issues, breathlessly reported on the, quote, resurgence of earth-based paganism, including Native American religions and goddess worship. In Rye, New York, an avant-garde priest holds an environmental Sabbath. His services feature prayers to earth, wind, fire, and water. One itinerant environmentalist conducts workshops in which participants are urged to remember their alleged evolutionary history by rolling around on the ground and imagining what it was like to be dead leaves, slugs, and lichen. Personally, I thought the aesthetic highlight of last week's televised Earth Day hoopla occurred as crowd members began reverently to howl like wolves. Other deep ecologists prefer direct action against corporate and corporate and governmental targets, ranging from theatrical civil disobedience to outright terror, sabotage, and violence. They man groups like Greenpeace, Earth First, Sea Shepherds, Rainforest Action Network, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and the Animal Liberation Front. This is all the first camp, the deep ecologists. Now, the second camp consists of the political heirs to the New Left, marching under the banners of green politics or social ecology. They at least profess a nominal concern for human values and modern culture. But their goal is a socialist redistributionist society, which they claim is not nature's proper steward and society's only hope. The most consistent of these join the various green parties and groups, but the more pragmatic, far more numerous, and far more sophisticated among them join the better-heeled fronts, including the National Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, the World Watch Institute, the Union of Concerned Scientists, or even the Environmental Protection Agency and its regulatory sisters. Now, these two camps, for all their feuds, both supplement each other. The deep ecologists set the moral tone and spiritual direction. They inspire, radicalize, and recruit. Meanwhile, the Greens and social ecologists translate these assets into political power, into proposals, manpower, candidates, and ultimately laws. Both factions, particularly the countercultural direct action groups, have been growing far faster than the old mainstream liberal tree-hugger groups, such as the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, and the National Wildlife Federation. These latter have struggled to keep up, becoming increasingly radicalized by the competitive demands of the environmentalist marketplace and by the logic of the environmental ethic itself. Now, what do I mean by the environmental ethic? In its purest form, the so-called environmental ethic was defined in 1966 by UCLA historian Lynn White Jr. and in 1972 by Norwegian philosopher Arne Nies. White blamed the ecological crisis on the West's Judeo-Christian heritage, which he said was based on the, quote, axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man, close quote. He called for a new religion based upon, quote, the spiritual autonomy of all parts of nature and the equality of all creatures, including man, close quote. Nies took this a step further. Individuals do not exist, he said. We're all only part of a larger ecosystem. The shallow ecology, he denigrated it, the shallow ecology of the mainstream conservation groups was still anthropocentric or homocentric, that is, man-centered. It aimed only at improving the environment for the benefit of humans. Deep ecology, on the other hand, led to a view of, quote, biospheric egalitarianism, the equal right of all things to live and blossom, close quote. In short, all things are created equal. They should be venerated as ends in themselves, as intrinsically valuable apart from man, and they have equal rights to their own kinds of self-realization, without human interference or, quote, exploitation, unquote. Now, the most prominent manifestation of biospheric egalitarianism, the modern animal rights movement, was born with the publication in 1975 of philosopher Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. Led by a group of young philosophy professors, this movement went far beyond traditional concerns for mere animal welfare or animal protection. Its basic premise was captured in the title of Singer's first chapter, quote, "All animals are equal," close quote. And I'm quoting again, "This book," Singer wrote, "is about the tyranny of human over non-human animals." What did he mean by this? That tyranny amounted, he said, to speciesism, which is akin to racism. A speciesist, Singer said, quote, "allows the interest of his species to override the greater interest of members of other species," close quote. Note the word greater. As philosopher Tom Regan, the author of The Case for Animal Rights, put it, quote, "The fundamental wrong is the system that allows us to view animals as our resources, here for us." Instead, both Singer and Regan held that all beings with the capacity to feel pleasure or pain have, quote, "an inherent value of their own." Or, as columnist Michael W. Fox asserted, quote, "each sentient being should be valued in and for itself," close quote. Now, according to three other such philosophers, this meant, quote, "there can be no rational excuse left for killing animals, be they killed for food, science, or sheer personal indulgence," close quote. Now, this meant no animal testing of medicines or surgical procedures, no meat, milk, or eggs, no hunting, circuses, or rodeos, no bird cages or dog pens, no leather, no use of animals, period. Now, how extreme can this get? Pretty extreme. Even man's most innocuous activities are viewed as intruding upon the rights of other species. Two philosophy professors addressing 200 marine scientists in Boston declared that whales have rights since, quote, "they have a mental life of greater sophistication than many humans," close quote. Now, based on what follows, you might tend to agree with them. They attacked the training of whales to perform in aquatic parks and even oceanic whale watching cruises. Whales, they said, and I'm quoting, "do not exist as visual commodities in an aquatic free market, and the business of taking eager sightseers into their waters is exploitative," close quote. There can be no compromises on animal rights, say its proponents. Stephen Wise, who heads a group called Attorneys for Animal Rights, contends, quote, it's one of my beefs about attorneys that I pick up from earlier, he contends, quote, "the lives of tens of millions of animals do not belong to us and are not ours to compromise," close quote. The authors of another animal rights anthology, All Philosophers, said, quote, "compromise in the traditional sense of the term is simple, unthinking weakness," close quote. Well, this fanaticism has led some activists to acts of terrorism and violence against the tyrant species. In April 1987, the Animal Liberation Front torched a university research building in Davis, California. In October 1988, the same group tossed paint and acid on the homes and cars of people working for the San Diego Zoo. Bombs have been planted at British fur stores, and this year at upscale department stores around San Francisco. Women wearing furs have been attacked on the streets of New York. One woman there was just convicted for attempting to murder the president of U.S. Surgical Corporation, which uses animals to teach doctors surgical procedures. This animal lover was captured with 2 pipe bombs filled with nails. And this February, the dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Tennessee was shot and killed execution style, 22 in the back of the head, by an unknown assailant whom police have good reason to suspect was an animal rights terrorist. Now, such acts are the cul-de-sac of the premise that animals have intrinsic value and inherent rights. To see why, it is important to grasp how different this view is from the Lockean-based tradition of rights. That tradition regards rights as arising from human nature. Rights are seen as moral principles that define the boundary lines necessary for peaceful interaction in society. The purpose of these boundaries is to let men pursue their well-being and happiness without interference. Regardless of your theory, any intelligible theory of rights must presuppose entities capable of defining and respecting moral boundary lines. But animals, by nature, are incapable of doing this. And since they are unable to know, respect, or exercise rights and respect boundary lines, the principle of rights simply can't be applied to or by animals. Rights are by nature based on a homocentric or man-centered view of the world. Practically, the notion of animal rights entails an absurd moral double standard. It declares that animals have the inherent right to survive as their nature demands, but that man doesn't. It declares that the only entity capable of recognizing moral boundaries is to sacrifice his interest to entities which can't. Ultimately, it means only animals have rights. Since nature consists largely of animals and their habitats, man must logically cede to them the entire planet. And they're explicit about it. Quote, "Is it not perverse to prefer the lives of mice and guinea pigs to the lives of men and women?" asked philosopher Patrick Corbett. Not really, he says, because, quote, "If we can stand back from the scientific and technological rat race for a moment, we realize that since animals are in many respects superior to ourselves, the argument collapses." Close quote. Man, snarls columnist Michael W. Fox in his book, Returning to Eden, man, quote, "is the most dangerous, destructive, selfish, and unethical animal on earth," close quote. You see, all animals may be equal in animal rights theory, but as Orwell pointed out in Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others. Now, some biospheric egalitarians have decided that even plants and inanimate objects have rights not to be used by humans. In a book called The Rights of Nature, Roderick Fraser Nash notes that ecological egalitarianism, as he calls it, quote, "accords nature ethical status at least equal to that of humans. The antipode," he says, "is anthropocentrism, according to which humans are the measure of all nature," close quote. Well, you think this is a silly, cranky thing that nobody would take seriously? I wish. In 1972, Christopher Stone published an article in the California Law Review titled, "Should Trees Have Standing? Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects." This absurd viewpoint was further dignified by the prominent liberal Harvard law professor Lawrence H. Tribe in a 1974 Yale Law Review Journal article, a Yale Law Journal article, and later in a book of essays. Worse yet, Stone's argument was actually accepted and cited in a 1972 dissenting opinion written by Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. The most successful of the deep ecology groups is Greenpeace International, whose activists engage in highly visible acts of civil disobedience, such as plugging up smokestacks and chemical waste pipes, or invading missile test sites on inflatable rafts. Their Robin Hood image has paid off with at least 4 million contributors worldwide and an annual income of over $100 million. Greenpeace has become the darling of the liberal media and the entertainment industry's charity of choice. The cable music network, VH1, financed and is airing several dozen free commercials for the group, all narrated by Hollywood celebrities. A movie about Greenpeace founder David McTaggart is also in the works. Even more disturbing is the fawning media treatment given to the group Earth First, the violent guerrilla arm of the deep ecology movement. It specializes in sabotaging bulldozers, tearing down billboards and power lines, putting nails on roads to stop logging trucks, and pounding spikes in trees to destroy saw blades. One of its slogans, believe it or not, is "Back to the Pleistocene," meaning back to the last ice age. Its other slogan is "No compromise" in defense of Mother Earth. Quote, "The one thing we have in common is an absolute conviction that the Earth comes first," says a U.S. government scientist who is a secret member. Another member, Christopher Maines, has just published a book, Green Rage, Radical Environmentalism and the Unmaking of Civilization. His closing line, "The time to make the choice between the natural and the cultural world has come." Human values, needless to say, even human life itself, means little to deep ecologists. In one interview, philosopher Arne Nies targeted ideal world population at 100 million people. Now, given that the current world population is about 5.3 billion people, what do deep ecologists hope will happen to the remaining 5.2 billion people? They're explicit about it. In the Los Angeles Times book review, David Graeber, a taxpayer-financed biologist for the National Park Service, offered this charming outlook. Quote, "Human happiness and certainly human fecundity are not as important as a wild and healthy planet. I know social scientists who remind me that people are part of nature, but it isn't true. Somewhere along the line, at about 1 billion years ago, maybe half that, we quit the contract and became a cancer. We have become a plague upon ourselves and upon the earth. Until such time as Homo sapiens should decide to rejoin nature, some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along." Close quote. That's a book review dutifully published by the Los Angeles Times. The endearing Mr. Graeber isn't alone in his death wish for the human race, as Earth First leader David Foreman makes clear. Quote, "We advocate biodiversity for biodiversity's sake. That says man is no more important than any other species. It may well take our extinction to set things straight." Close quote. Foreman therefore finds a silver lining in the horrible Ethiopian famines. They are, he says, Mother Earth's natural defense against overpopulation. Likewise, his group's official publication has cheerfully suggested that from an ecological perspective, the AIDS epidemic might mean the end of industrialism, which is, quote, "the main force behind the environmental crisis. Thus," still quoting, "thus, as radical environmentalists, we can see AIDS not as a problem, but as a necessary solution," close quote. One recalls that the Nazis, who also declared a mystical, romantic kinship with nature and wildness, similarly confronted the existence of undesirable populations with their own final solution. But the Nazis were far less ambitious. Despite such nihilistic views and criminally destructive acts, Earth First is being treated more and more reverentially by the liberal media. David Foreman, arrested by the FBI for conspiring to sabotage 2 nuclear power plants, was giving a highly flattering profile on CBS's 60 Minutes program. This past week, his group was glowingly depicted in a segment narrated by pop singer Carole King for the syndicated program A Current Affair. Former Senator Gaylord Nelson, who founded the first Earth Day and is now with the mainstream Wilderness Society, has said, quote, "I think groups like Greenpeace and Earth First make a significant contribution to the educational process," close quote. Daryl Kanufke, the regional coordinator for the Wilderness Society, calls Earth First, quote, "extremely important to the movement," close quote. Earth First's growing acceptance by the media and mainstream environmentalists demonstrates the radicalization process within the movement. Environmentalist guru David Brower, who built the Sierra Club to prominence, explains how this works. Quote, "I founded Friends of the Earth to make the Sierra Club look reasonable. Then I founded the Earth Island Institute to make Friends of the Earth look reasonable. Earth First now makes us look reasonable. We're still waiting for someone to come along and make Earth First look reasonable," close quote. In fact, Earth First David Foreman was the chief lobbyist for the Wilderness Society up until 1980, when he quit because it was too moderate for his tastes. Likewise, even the direct action group Greenpeace was too tame for Paul Watson, one of its co-founders. So he founded Sea Shepherds, a more violent group which boasts of having sunk 12 whaling ships. Now, what is the distinctive aspect of human nature that so offends these radical environmentalists? As they make clear in virtually every utterance, it is man's power to reason and everything that flows from it. Abstract knowledge, science, technology, material wealth, industrial society, the capitalistic system. Animals, lacking any rational capacity, survive by adapting themselves to nature. But human beings can survive only by utilizing reason to, to adapt nature to themselves. They do this in the following way. To subsist, man must unavoidably use and disrupt animals and their habitats, transforming natural resources into food, clothing, shelter, and tools. By nature and necessity, man is a developer. To traditional Western thinkers, this was man's power and his glory. To deep ecologists, however, man is the only thorn in an otherwise perfect Garden of Eden. They go beyond or below even Marx, rejecting even his labor theory of value and substituting a natural resources standard of value. They equate natural resources with capital, and their development with capital consumption. To develop as man must is to destroy. That is why to them, nature includes everything in the universe except human nature. Deep ecology is an example of what I call neutron philosophy. It kills people while leaving their environment intact. Now, while the deep ecologists denounce a man-centered perspective toward nature, the more pragmatic political organs of the environmental movement are nervous to admit such an underlying animus. Instead, to garner power and influence, they posture as friends of humanity. In well-furnished offices, their lawyers and lobbyists crank out endless reports and legislative proposals, often wrapped in the mantle of science. But even the scientists among them look at the facts through green-colored lenses. In his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, Dr. Paul Ehrlich declared, quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death. Nothing can prevent the substantial increase in the world's death rate. We must have population control at home, hopefully through a system of incentives and penalties, but by compulsion if voluntary methods fail," close quote. Well, the only mass famines or deaths that occurred were politically engineered by communist governments in Cambodia and Ethiopia, places like that. Everywhere else, food production went up. Population soared, death rates went down, life expectancy increased. Those little details haven't ruined Ehrlich's credibility with the liberal media. He's now an official commentator for NBC TV and has another book out predicting similar Malthusian horrors. Then there was the great angst over the nuclear winter. You do remember the nuclear winter. Nuclear war was going to bring about a vast overcast that would freeze the planet, destroying all life. After all, our nation's preeminent green astronomer, Dr. Carl Sagan, said so. Immediate nuclear disarmament was the only answer, said the good doctor, his message amplified billions and billions of times by the liberal media. Alas and alas, later studies have determined that his calculations from computer models had been badly flawed. The dreaded nuclear winter would only be a predicted 2-week cold snap, but that information never made it to the front pages. And how about the great asbestos scare? All that insulation in our homes and schools was going to create a cancer epidemic. Well, a 1988 Harvard symposium and articles in Science magazine and the New England Journal of Medicine have all confirmed that levels of exposure to asbestos faced by most home occupants aren't dangerous at all. Nonetheless, the EPA-generated asbestos scare has cost the public millions in tax dollars, depressed real estate prices, and asbestos removal has actually increased the danger by stirring up asbestos particles. Similar scientific nonsense undergirds the scares over the ozone hole. I can go over that with you later if you want. Ozone hole, acid rain, radon gas in our homes, and the great Alar on our apples cancer scare of 1989, which is my current Reader's Digest project. To understand how the Greens have gotten away with all this, let's just take one environmental controversy in some depth, the greenhouse effect. In the sweltering summer of 1988, Dr. James Hansen, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, gave alarming Senate testimony. Quote, "The Earth is warmer in 1988 than at any time in the history of instrumental measurements. The 4 warmest years have all been in the 1980s. In my opinion, the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now," close quote. Well, Hansen's statements touched off a firestorm of environmentalist hot air. In his book, Global Warming, published by the Sierra Club, Dr. Stephen Schneider of the National Center for Atmospheric Research painted this plausible scenario, as he calls it, plausible scenario of a greenhouse future. A thick black haze over Chicago caused by forest fires in Canada, a killer heat wave in New York, and a hurricane that devastates Long Island, all generated by the greenhouse effect. Time magazine, which has become the weekly reader of the environmental movement, speculated that the Great Plains could be depopulated as people migrated to escape droughts and heat. In Popular Science, John Milliman of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute warned, quote, "Don't buy land in New Orleans. Melting polar ice," he said, "could raise sea levels and inundate coastal cities." Quoting, "New York City might drown," wrote environmentalist Jonathan Schell in Discover magazine, summarizing the views of some scientists. Quote, "Or if it managed to hold back the waters, it might become as hot as the Sahara," close quote. Paul Ehrlich again warned NBC's Today Show audiences that, quote, "We could expect to lose all of Florida, Washington, D.C., and the Los Angeles basin," close quote. Elsewhere, he added that chronic droughts caused by global warming could result in 50 to 400 million deaths by starvation. But what is the evidence for global warming? And are the proposed governmental remedies cost-effective, or would they actually cause us even more harm than would any warming itself? That's what I tried to find out over a period of several months from my February Reader's Digest article titled, "What is the Truth About Global Warming?" And here are just a few of the facts I found out. When sunlight warms the Earth, part of it's reflected back into space as heat. But certain gases in the lower atmosphere trap some of this rising heat, like the glass in a greenhouse. Now, this trapped heat warms our planet to an average temperature of some 59 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, this trapped heat makes life on Earth possible. The heat-trapping gases, or so-called greenhouse gases, include water vapor and trace amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and man-made chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. So the existence of the greenhouse effect is a matter of established science and is non-controversial. So is the fact that these gases have been building up in our atmosphere. Now, nature accounts for most of the greenhouse gases, but much of the buildup over the past century is man-made. For example, burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, wood, and natural gas gives off carbon dioxide, which has grown in the atmosphere by an estimated 25% since the Industrial Revolution began. That sounds ominous. But the actual amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is minuscule, only about 290 parts per million, or, translated, less than 1/3 of 1/10 of 1%. So even a 25% increase of such a tiny amount of gas may have a negligible effect upon world temperatures. Nevertheless, some researchers claim that the globe has already warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit over the past century. Using mathematical computer models of the global climate, they predict that a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the next 50 years may raise global temperatures from 3 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. This, they say, could cause droughts, killer heat waves, monster hurricanes, flooded coastlines due to melting polar ice caps. Now, virtually all scientists agree that if greenhouse gases increase and all other factors remain the same, the Earth must warm up. But other factors aren't remaining the same. Clouds trap rising heat, but they also reflect sunlight back into space, keeping the planet some 20 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than it would be under clear skies. Many scientists think that if global warming occurs, it would produce more clouds through evaporation. And the increased cloud cover might act as a natural thermostat, blocking the incoming sunlight and sending the temperatures right back down again. Oceans have a major effect upon climate too, but their interaction with the atmosphere is so complex that scientists are only crudely representing these processes in their computer models. This uncertainty renders predictions virtually useless. For example, what about this sea level increase that we've been hearing so much about? Nine new studies presented at the American Geophysical Society's fall 1989 meeting concluded that the polar ice caps will grow, not melt, in the event of global warming. Why? Because a warmer atmosphere will carry more moisture, meaning increased snowfall at the North and South poles. In the face of this, the scientists cut earlier computer predictions of a 3-foot sea level rise. They cut it down to only about a foot, even then conceding that sea levels could even drop a couple of inches over the next 50 years. This is the level of certainty we're talking about. Other powerful natural cycles, sunspot activity, volcanic eruptions, changes in Earth rotation or orbit over many thousands of years, and what is simply called natural variability of the climate, that is, large and seemingly spontaneous climate changes with no obvious cause, can easily overwhelm any warming impact of minute greenhouse gas increases. Global warming has generated a new argument, however, for preserving and increasing wilderness areas. When trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide, and when they burn, they emit it. Environmentalists therefore demand that in areas like Brazil, where deforestation is occurring, we write off the huge debts that such nations owe us in exchange for preserving forests and lessening the potential threat of global warming. That prescription neatly advances both their environmentalist and redistributionist agendas. But in temperate regions, millions of acres are planted with seedling trees each year, offsetting much of the lost forest in the tropics. And researchers have recently discovered that the carbon content of the world's forest for years now has been vastly overestimated. This suggests that deforestation may not be as great a source of carbon dioxide as once thought, and, as a corollary, that the expensive tree planting campaigns that we're all hearing about will mitigate far less carbon dioxide buildup than originally calculated. Well, given all these uncertainties, I asked Dr. Hansen what constituted the best arguments and evidence for global warming. And here's what he told me. First, he said, is the evidence of what occurs on other planets like Venus and Mars as a result of their greater or lesser concentrations of greenhouse gases. Second is the Earth's own climate record. Scientists drilling into the 2-mile-thick Antarctic ice sheet have sampled air bubbles trapped as the ice built up. There were lower concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide during the ice ages, but much higher concentrations during the warm interglacial periods. Hansen regards this correlation between past gas concentrations and temperatures as the global warming theory's, quote, most important check. Third is the actual temperature record of the past 130 years when greenhouse gases have been rapidly increasing. Average global temperatures, he says, have risen about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century, more than what would have been expected due to natural variations in the climate. And, he said, the 5 warmest years in the history of instrumental measurements are in the 1980s. Fourth is the mathematical confirmation from computerized climate models These show that the climate should have warmed up about 1 degree Fahrenheit during the past century, which Hansen says is exactly what the temperature records show. Finally, there is just the inherent logic of the theory itself. Quote, "The one thing that has the greatest impact on my thinking is the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide over the past century," he says. "It's just inconceivable," he adds, that is not affecting our climate. It's just a logical, well-reasoned conclusion that the greenhouse is here now." Close quote. Now, all this sounds perfectly convincing, doesn't it? Sounds really good. Well, let's consider each of these arguments one at a time. First, the planetary comparisons. Since everyone already agrees that carbon dioxide traps heat, confirmation of this fact from other planets doesn't really get us very far. The examples of Venus and Mars are so extreme, so different, and so complicated by other factors that they can't begin to tell us how much temperatures on this world will react to variations and fluctuations in carbon dioxide. How about the ice core evidence? Ice core samples seem to show a direct correlation between fluctuations in the past temperatures and the concentrations of greenhouse gases. But here's how it would have to work. To suggest that carbon dioxide changes cause the temperature changes, the buildup of carbon dioxide obviously would have to have preceded the rising temperatures, right? And falling levels of carbon dioxide would have had to precede the falling temperatures. That's the only way you could show a cause and effect relationship between gas concentrations and temperatures. So I ask Hansen, which came first historically? The changes in the levels of carbon dioxide or the changes in temperature? Much to my astonishment, Hansen admitted that the temperature changes occurred first. In other words, during the warm interglacial periods, global temperatures went up first, and then the levels of carbon dioxide rose. Likewise, during the ice ages, the temperatures went down first, and then the levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide fell. As Hansen conceded, in fact, he says, quoting, "In fact, the CO2 changes do seem to follow the temperature changes, not precede them," close quote. Now, remember, these ice core records are supposed to be his, quote, "most important check," unquote, on the global warming theory. Hard evidence that the greenhouse gases force changes in Earth temperatures. But the sequence of events that they reveal is exactly backwards. Temperature records compiled by several climate research units, including Hansen's Goddard Institute, show about 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming over the past century, a period which has also seen a noticeable increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. There's another widely reported statistic that the 6 warmest years globally since instrumental records began about 100 years ago have all been in the 1980s. But it turns out that these temperature records are far from reliable. In the past, there were relatively few measurements in the vast oceans of the southern hemisphere. Thermometers were often moved. Shipboard temperature readings were affected by the air, sun, and plumbing, usually in an upward direction. And most land thermometer readings were artificially inflated by the growth of nearby cities and airports, which generated and reflected heat. When Hansen's own temperature records were recently corrected for such biases, they had to be revised sharply downward. Even so, the temperature records just don't jibe with the greenhouse theory. Between 1880 and 1940, temperatures appeared to rise. Yet between 1940 and 1965, a period of much heavier carbon dioxide emissions, temperatures fell. But the biggest problem for the global warmers is emerging data calling into question even the 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming over the past century. In late 1988, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found absolutely no evidence of any warming trend over the continental U.S. during the past century. Then, the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory reported that during the past century, temperatures in the southern U.S. have actually fallen half a degree Fahrenheit and fallen a full degree Fahrenheit in the past 30 years. Then, the global oceanic temperature records were carefully corrected for various biases by scientists from MIT and the British Meteorological Office. Their conclusion, quote, "No appreciable difference," close quote, between temperatures in 1856 and 1986, a 130-year period. The claim that the 6 warmest years globally since reliable records began have all been in the 1980s, I found originated with the East Anglia Climatic Research Unit in Britain, and it's appeared in countless media stories and government reports. I even used it in my article. But upon further checking, I found that it and similar claims had been irresponsibly exaggerated by global warming scientists. And now, much more accurate satellite measurements by NASA have detected absolutely no net global warming for the 10-year period ending in 1988. Taking everything into account, the U.S. Department of Energy concludes that, quote, it is difficult to gather consistent, reliable data to provide evidence of a temperature change. Richard Lindzen of MIT's Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences says flatly, quote, the data as we have it does not support a warming, close quote. And that's the scientific consensus, by the way, despite what you may have read or heard from media consciousness raisers. Virtually all atmospheric scientists reject Hansen's claim that any apparent warming trend in his data could be confidently attributed to the greenhouse effect. Last May, a 61 atmospheric scientists participating in a greenhouse workshop in Amherst, Massachusetts, issued a statement that, quote, such an attribution cannot now be made with any degree of confidence, close quote. That leaves the greenhouse proponents only their computer models. But as we all know, a computer is no more reliable than its input, which we've already seen is faulty. The enormous complexity of their task forces climate modelers to divide the globe into vast grid squares, each summarized by just a few weather statistics. Poorly understood cloud, oceanic, and hydrologic processes are only crudely represented in these computer models. Stephen Schneider concedes that most models predict at least twice as much warming should have occurred this past century than the greenhouse theorists think has actually happened. He writes that it's a, quote, even bet that the models have been overestimating future warming by a factor of 2. Not surprisingly, of course, since it was these very computer models that gave us Carl Sagan's nuclear winter theory. For now, the lack of hard evidence and reliable tools has left proponents of global warming with little but a theory that, for many, is an article of faith. Despite all this, environmentalists are admonishing us to adopt drastic political, economic, and lifestyle changes to protect us against a threat that may never materialize. Today, coal, oil, and other fossil fuels provide 90% of the world's energy. And yet environmentalists propose huge tax increases to discourage fossil fuels. An EPA report suggested that, quote, the government could increase the price of fossil fuels by imposing charges or fees, at the same time reducing the price of desirable alternatives by providing subsidies, close quote. The World Watch Institute suggests a hefty carbon tax on fossil fuels to compel people to switch away from coal, oil, and natural gas and toward, quote, renewable energy sources, including solar and wind power and the like. Senators Albert Gore, Timothy Worth, and others have introduced bills to force major expensive changes in fuel efficiency, to reduce carbon emissions and to halt international deforestation. Other proposals would discourage automobile use and encourage mass transit and foster drastic population control. The most green thing about these proposals is the color of the money they'd cost. Estimates from an array of economists range from $800 billion to $3.6 trillion. EPA Director William Riley concedes that, quote, to slow down the global heating process, the scale of economic and societal intervention will be enormous. It will involve far greater inconvenience, dislocation, and cost, close quote. This prospect, more primitive lifestyles and massive state planning, has environmentalists positively salivating. Their political problem, however, is how to build public sentiment for this taxing and spending orgy, particularly at a time of considerable red ink. The answer is fear. Whether the issue is ALAR, radon, ozone holes, or global warming, environmentalists use the same basic tactic. First, they proclaim some terrible doom right around the corner. When responsible critics demand evidence, the environmentalists reply, well, there seems to be disagreement and uncertainty between us. But the consequences of this possible threat are so dangerous that As an act of prudence, we can't afford to wait until all the facts are in. We have to act as if the threat were real. Jonathan Schell explains this, quote, "In the past, action usually awaited the confirmation of theory by hard evidence. Now, in a widening sphere of decisions, the costs of error are so exorbitant that we need to act on theory alone, which is to say, on prediction alone," close quote. Scientists, he adds, must, quote, "disavow the certainty and precision that they normally insist on. Scientists need to become connoisseurs and philosophers of uncertainty. The incurable uncertainty," notice, incurable uncertainty of our predicament, "far from serving to reassure us, should fill us with unease and goad us to action," close quote. In the face of this uncertainty, says Stephen Schneider, quote, "A few tens of billions or perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars spent annually around the world for such planetary insurance is an investment that is long overdue," close quote. This insurance policy ruse neatly switches the burden of proof from those proposing a theory onto those who are demanding evidence. By this nifty logical inversion, the theorist no longer has to prove his case. Rather, the skeptic is somehow supposed to refute a case for which no evidence has been offered in the first place. The absence of evidence is now cleverly relabeled uncertainty, against which we are exhorted to buy expensive insurance policies. What does this mean? Precisely because we have no case, say the environmentalists, you'd better do what we say. Ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing more than an extortion racket relying on our own self-doubt to be the enforcer. Stephen Schneider admits to an ethical dilemma about all this. He says that sometimes to advance their views with the public, scientists, quote, "have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have," close quote. Each scientist, he cautions, must decide, quote, "the right balance between being effective and being honest. I hope that means being both," close quote. This guy works for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. But since when are scientists supposed to balance the truth with anything else? Undeniably, painting scary scenarios is effective in getting worried congressmen to plunk millions of tax dollars into research projects run, of course, by devoted, selfless scientists like Dr. Schneider. Clearly, the American people are never going to buy the deep ecology outlook of Earth First or the Animal Liberation Front. But these groups make the more pragmatic political left-wing groups look more responsible, and they are cashing in. National Resources Defense Council, World Watch Institute, the Environmental Defense Fund are manipulating scares over global warming and pesticides, not to destroy man, but to turn him into a harnessed beast of burden, with themselves holding the reins. For example, Senator Timothy Worth told Jonathan Schell that, quote, "We've got to try to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we'll all be doing the right thing anyway in terms of economic policy and environmental policy," close quote. And what kind of economic policy are we talking about? Stephen Schneider says that solving problems like global warming will require us to, quote, "redistribute our current resources, thus altering accustomed levels of expenses and incomes," close quote. Time magazine says, quote, "Americans will have to find alternative sources of energy and use all fuels more efficiently. What all this requires is self-discipline on the part of the world's haves and increased assistance to the have-nots," close quote. Botanist Peter Raven told a Pittsburgh conference this month that, quote, the people at the top are consuming far, far more than the vast majority of people at the bottom. It's much too unequal in a way that affects the sustainable productivity of the world," close quote. Don't assume that the motive here is sympathy for the poor. The massive anticipated job losses in existing fossil fuel industries don't even faze the environmentalist. Quote, "I realize that such a switch would be a staggering blow to the coal mining industry," says Stephen Schneider. Quote, But where is it written that anyone has an indefinite right to anti-social or anti-environmental employment? Close quote. Paul Ehrlich, too, makes it clear that the environmentalist goal isn't to make poor people better off. One American, he told the Pittsburgh conference, causes 20 times more ecological destruction than one person in the third world. And one rich American causes 1,000 times more destruction. Since increasing wealth equals increasing destruction by this formula, Ehrlich concludes, quote, actually, the problem in the world is that there are too many rich people, close quote. So the basic alternative within the environmental movement is between the social ecologists who want to rid the planet of excessive rich people and the deep ecologists who just want to rid the planet of the people, period. Underlying it all is an antipathy for a complex, technical, and free society where survival is bought at the cost of ambition, learning, foresight, and hard work in a competitive, free marketplace. One sees the environmentalist motivation clearly captured in the book title, Returning to Eden, a woozy yearning to return to an egalitarian garden where fruit drops from the tree into one's lap, where the struggle to survive ceases, where all animals lie down in peace and harmony. If you're a deep ecologist, the ecosystem will take care of you. If you're a social ecologist, the social system will. But either way, environmentalism's Eden is a place where idle wishes will be the coin of the realm. Here, as in the case of criminals, one sees at root the same revolt against individual self-responsibility, the same desire for something for nothing, the same yearnings for power over others, except that, if anything, criminals display far more guts and initiative. With the collapse of communism, environmentalism has become freedom's new battleground in the 90s. Our defense lies not in politicking, nor even in economic education, but in something far more basic. It lies in accepting our own nature and the responsibilities that flow from it. By fulfilling our nature and responsibilities, we bring meaning and value into the world. Whatever they wish to call themselves, the contemporary children of Rousseau are at war with human nature, with Homo sapiens and the homocentric view of the world. Driven by fanatical hostility, they cannot be bought off by appeasement and compromises, which will only weaken our free society and its cultural institutions. However, they can be rendered harmless if we reject their Procrustean moral premise that reduces man to or below the status of mice, weeds, and soil. The existence of civilization proves that we are not nature's cancer, but her crown jewel. This is indeed a beautiful setting for our conference, a beautiful environment for the work of man. But it is meaningless, unseen, and appreciated without us. It is a frame in which we are the picture. From that perspective, environmentalism means sacrificing the picture to spare the frame. No, man is not a cancer on the planet. It is radical environmentalists, after all, who pray for infectious human disease. We shall inoculate ourselves and our civilization against the environmentalist infection on the day when we finally confront their charge of speciesism with buttons and bumper stickers proudly declaring our own form of species solidarity. Without apology, then, let me be the first to come out of the closet and confess I am a practicing homocentric. Thank you very much.